Chag Sameach, Rabotai. We're going to continue with Pirkeh Avot from where we left off last time, chapter 2, in Mishna Chet. It says over here, as we said, right, that last time we were talking about when a person has too much of a certain thing, it's not good for him. So it continues with this theme over here. And the next one is Marbe Shefachot, Marbe Zima. Marbe Abadim, Marbe Gazel. So what does this mean? That in the old days, right, people used to have really like slaves, male slaves and female slaves. So today we don't have really slaves, there's no slavery, right? Abraham Lincoln already abolished slavery. So we don't have that anymore, right? So, as we said, that there's no more slavery, but the point is still the same. So what does that mean? We do have servants, that serve us, maids, servants, and the males and females, butlers, and all kinds of things, depending on who you are and what you are. So it says, right, if you have many of the female ones, you're going to have marbe zima. So what does that mean? What's going to cause you zima? What is zima? Zima means improper behavior, illicit relations. So why is that? Because these women slaves, they tend to be, promiscuous. So if you bring them into the house and you have a lot of them, you're going to have some problems with promiscuity. But this is what's going to be with them,
what does that mean in English?
I'm sorry?
What does that mean? What's the word that you said?
Zima.
No, the other one.
That's what it means in Hebrew.
Okay.
Zima.
Okay.
You know Zima, right?
Yeah. Okay. What does that mean?
Right,
You just said it in English.
yeah. Promiscuity, right? In other words, illicit relations. So, what does that mean? That these ladies tend to be, they don't have the proper approach, when it comes to these things. They come very cheap. They don't really, they don't really hold themselves. They don't have morality, proper morality. So because of that, they do all kinds of improper things. Some guy goes with them. This, and they have some things going on. This guy and this family member and the brother and the uncle and the God knows had something with her. Why? Because she's very easy to get, right? She has no lines. She has no moral values, to stop that. So because of that, right, it causes these kinds of problems. So in order to explain to you what this means is that in the old days, they used to have really like slaves, Eved. So what does that mean? This Eved was Jewish or not Jewish? How was it? Eved, the Shifcha, it was Jewish or not Jewish? So the truth is, most of them were not Jewish. Right? They were goyim. So what they used to do is, buy this person as an eved, as a slave or shifcha, and then they would convert them somewhat. They would put them in the mikveh, So now they became like eved, who has to do the mitzvot of a woman. But the thing is, since they come from the goyim, they're not really so careful. They're not so medakdik about illicit relations, about zima. So therefore, they're going to get into trouble. This is what's going to happen with them. Now they put her into the mikveh. Right, as we said, this girl, So is she now really Jewish? In other words, is a Jewish guy allowed to marry her, to be with her? That's the question, right? So the answer is no. Why? Because she's still a slave. So a Jewish man is not allowed to have relations with a slave, with an eved. Eved Kanani, what's what we call it, right? So therefore, if he does something with her, it's a big sin. It's a big averah. This is the reason why, right? So when you have too many of these girls around, because some people like to have the rich people, wealthy people, they like to have a lot of servants, a lot of maid servants. They think, I got this one, I got this one who cleans the kitchen, I got this one who does the cooking, I got this one, They have too many of them and it causes big problems. That's what we're saying, right? So therefore, what's the proper thing to do? If you need to have one of these girls, these maid servants, right? These slaves, whatever, in the old days, what you have to do is not to get too much, because otherwise it's going to get you into trouble. Same thing with the males, right? Now we're going to talk about the males. What about the men? The problem is with the men, right? It says marbe abadim and marbe gazel. So what does that mean? If you bring too many slaves, male slaves, to help you in the house, there's going to be a lot of theft over there, right? Theft. You know why that is? Because these slaves, these abadim, they like to steal. They got their hands everywhere. So when you bring a lot of them into the house to help you with the house, they're going to be stealing stuff there, taking stuff like this, And you're going to have a problem with theft in the house. And you're going to be wondering, oh, who took my thing over here? Who took my thing over here? Who took it? And you have a slave in the house. What do you think, right? What do you think took it? you have abadim, you have slaves in the house. They're the ones who are stealing everything, right? The Jewish people, in general, right, they don't steal like that. They don't do things like that. So it must be the Eved, the slave that's doing this to you. I'll tell you a funny story about this, and you'll understand the idea. That I was told by a man, a rabbi. There was actually a case where, there was a certain Chacham, his name is Rabbi Akiva Eger. So Rabbi Akiva Eger was Gedol Ador, big Chacham in Russia, 250 years ago. Big Chacham over there. So what happened was, that the king, the Melech over there in that country, he used to like to invite him over, to talk about, religion, philosophy, all kinds of things, He liked to have the rabbi in his house, the palace. So he'd invite him over, and they would sit together, and talk words of wisdom, words of chokhmah. He respected him, whatever, right? This Melech. Goy, it was a Goy, right? So what happened was that one time, they were sitting together, and the king asks Rabbi Akiva Eger, he tells him, he says, I see, he says, in your Talmud, what it says, that Esav was Rasha, and Yaakov was Tzaddik. That's what it says in your Talmud, right? Esav was Rasha, big Rasha. But he says, you know what? He says, I look in the Chumash, and I don't see that Esav was Rasha. That he did it over there and he sinned. He said, I don't see anything like that. He says, I don't see nothing like that. What do you, so why are you rabbis saying that Esav was a Rasha? Does it say that he killed somebody in the Chumash? Doesn't say nothing like that. So what do you mean Esav? He says, maybe, your rabbis, the problem with them. You know what the problem is? The problem is that, they're biased, they like Yaakov because he's their father, and they don't like Esav because he's my father. What do you think, right? That's the whole thing, That's the whole thing. That's not because what they say is true, it's just because they're biased. That's what it is. They're prejudiced. Oh. So, Rabbi Akiva Eger, here's the king, right? Melech, saying this, So he didn't answer him, for a second, right? So what happened was that then they brought the dinner for the king, the Melech, right? They brought him the dinner. So what happened was, right, that the Melech, sees the dinner coming, right, to eat, terfot, nevelot, all kinds of good stuff there, like shrimp, lobster, right, all kinds of good stuff. So what happens is, right, that he comes in and he says, you know what? He says, excuse me, Rabbi. He says, the food just came. He says, I'm going to go wash my hands, to eat my dinner. So what happened was he was wearing a ring. The kings, usually they have like these rings, tabat, whatever, right? Fancy ring, signet ring, So he takes it off. He says, excuse me, Rabbi. So he takes it off and he tells him, he says, I'm going to wash my hands now. So what does he do? He goes, the king, the Melech, to wash his hands. And then, comes back. After, to start his dinner, right? To dig in, right? Get into it. He said, Sauda. Right? So, what happened? He looks around, on the table. The ring is gone, Hey, what happened over here? The ring is missing, I just want to wash my hands. I come back and it's gone. So, what does he do, right? He tells the servants, tells them, he says, where's my ring? Who took my ring over here? What's going on? Somebody over here is stealing, huh? Ah! He says, you better put it back. He tells them, you better put it back right now. Otherwise there's going to be big trouble over here. Somebody's going to give up his life. He's going to be hung. Right? For taking my ring. So what happened, right? That, nobody's coming, to give him the ring. So what happened? Right, the servant comes in, some kushi guy, right, some kushi comes in to bring his food, more food, things like this, whatever, right, side dishes, things like this, right, brings it in, and the king looks, the Melech, looks at this kushi, he looks and he says, you took my ring, you ganav, you took it, so, so what happened? He says, you better put it down now. Give it back to me. Otherwise, I'll have you hung today. You're gonna be hung. I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna execute you right here. So the slave was like looking at the king. Says, I didn't take nothing. What do you want from me? the Eved. Tells him like this. So all of a sudden, like it's a big balagan. The king is like, screaming, yelling, angry. You know what I mean? The Eved is over here, the rabbi is over here on the left side. Big balagan. So big tension, big drama over here. So what happens, right? All of a sudden, the rabbi reaches into his pocket, and takes out the ring and puts it on the table. He says, Rabbi, here. He says, here, Melech. He says, King, this is your ring. Take it. There you go. So the king, is like shocked, whatever. He says, look, he takes the ring, puts it on his hand. So Rabbi Akiva Eger tells him like this. He says, excuse me, he says, Your Honor the King. He says, when you were looking for your ring, right, and looking for the one who stole it, why didn't you suspect me? That I took it. You didn't think about that, did you? You didn't say nothing about me. So, what does he tell him? He tells him, he says, I know what you are. You're a holy Kadosh Rabbi. He says, you're gonna steal my ring? You know what I mean? I know you wouldn't do that. But this guy, he says, he's Eved, she right Kushi. He says, for sure I was thinking that he took it, because they're all thieves, these guys. That's what he tells him. He says, well, that's why I suspected him and not you. So, so now, right, Rabbi Akiva Eger answers him, right, about his question that he asked him before. He says, now you see. Why did the rabbis say that Esav was Rasha, and Yaakov was Tzaddik? Why did they say that? You know why? He says, because just like what you said, that usually, right, it's the Eved, it's a servant that's going to be stealing, because he's Rasha. Everybody knows they're all Ganavim, these Avadim. They're all Ganavim. He says, but right, rabbis are not Ganavim, they don't steal rings, from the table. So that's why you didn't suspect me. It's the same thing with the rabbis. The rabbis also suspected Esav. You know why? Because Esav was known to be Rasha, So whatever, all the sins that they could put on him, they put on him. You know why? Because they assume that because he's Rasha, he did all these sins, Because it says in the Chumash that Esav did 5 sins, the day of the Bar Mitzvah, that he had Bar Mitzvah.
You didn't say it in the Chumash.
What? What's that?
It wasn't clear in the Chumash. You said in the Chumash it's mentioned there.
No, in the Chumash it's not mentioned.
Yes.
But it says in the Chazal.
The Chazal,
Right. So what does it say in the Chazal? He did 5 sins that day. I'll explain to you. He did 5 sins that day, Esav, right? That day. What were the sins? He killed somebody, right? Retzach. Who did he kill? He killed Nimrod that day, right? He had a fight with him. He had a duel, He went out, and killed him. He killed Nimrod. So one thing is he did murder. Number 2? Esav killed Nimrod, yeah. There's a whole story behind that. I'm not going to get into that now, right? So, number 2, right, they say he took a Nara Me'orasai, a girl who was betrothed to get married, to somebody, and he had relations with her, So he committed adultery also. Can you imagine? He did that sin too. What else did he do? Right? He was Kofer Beikar. He said that day, he says, I don't believe in God. I'm atheist. Right? People today also, same problem, right? A lot of people are atheists today. They don't believe in God. Number 3, he said, right, that this is all nonsense, Avodat Hashem, right, to serve Hashem. The Keuna, right? He didn't want to buy the Bechorah he didn't want to keep the Bechorah, so he sold it to Yaakov. So he denied all, he did 5 sins that day. Like this. Boom, 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 boom. So this is what the king was complaining about. You understand, Jonathan? He was like, how do the rabbis know he did 5 sins? Doesn't say that in the Chumash.
Yes.
So he says, you know why? Because since they knew that he's a Rasha, they attribute all the sins to him. Just like you attributed, right, the theft of the ring to this Eved and not me. Now you understand why the rabbis did what they did. He explained to him. He says, now you got it. He tells him. So the king learned a lesson from this, Musar. He learned some Musar from the rabbi, So same thing over here, right? What are we saying over here in this Pirkeh Avot? We're saying, right, if you bring avadim, if you bring slaves into your house, these butlers, the servants, right? They're all ganavim, these people, they steal, So when you bring them, we know for sure there's going to be gezel in your house. There's going to be gneva. There's going to be things being stolen, right? They stole this. I'll tell you guys a funny story. We'll finish here, Funny story, a true story. Right? What happened was that a few months ago in my building over here, they decided you know, they had like those old fuse, you know, those fuse things, you know, boards with the fuses, you know, the fuse, you know what those things, right? They yeah, you know, right, exactly. So what happened was that these are old, you know, from like 50, 60 years ago, you know, like antiquar, you know, right, whatever. So they came into the building and they said, you know what, we're going to switch them now. We're going to put circuit breakers, you know, which is the good one, right? The modern one. You know, that's the one you want. Right? You don't want fuses, right? So what happened was that they're changing them, you know, and coming to each apartment, you know, and bringing, you know, this guy to work her, you know, some Spanioli guy, right? Whatever, right? So they're bringing him to change, you know, the board, the luach, and put circuit breaker. So what happened was, you know, that they came to our apartment. You know, they came. Guess what? You know, this Ganav, what does he do? He puts like a curtain, you know, in front of him, you know, so he can't see what he's doing, you know. And right in front of him over there, where he was working, there was a cabinet, you know, with some expensive, you know, china, you know. So what did he do? He took like a big piece of china, you know, and he stole it from us, you know. So then what happened was that once he finished the job, you know, my mother tells me, he says, I don't see where this piece is over here. You know, he stole it. Can you imagine? He stole the china in the house, you know, when he came to work there. This is what happens, you understand? So when you bring people like this into the house, you know you're gonna get robbed. You're gonna get robbed. That's what the Pirkeh Avot is telling you. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen. רבי שאומר, רצה הקדוש ברוך הוא לכל זוהר, לפיכך תקבע להם תורה ומצוות שנאמר אדוני חפץ, למען צדקו יגדיל תורה ויאדיר.